and through fertile valleys, where we saw Indians in a state of nudity, who looked at us from a distance, but never approached our wagons nor molested anyone. On the 24th of September we turned due north, and found the tracks of wagon wheels, which guided us to the valley of Mary's River, or Ogden's River, and on the 30th put us on the old emigrant road leading from Fort Hall. This welcome landmark inspired us with renewed trust, and the energizing hope that Stanton and McCutchen would soon appear strengthened our sorely tried courage. This day was also memorable because it brought us a number of Indians who must have been Frémont's guides, for they could give information and understand a little English. They went into camp with us, and by word and sign explained that we were still far from the sink of Mary's River, but on the right trail to it. After another long day's drive, we stopped on a mountainside, close to a spring of cold, sweet water. While supper was being prepared, one of the fires crept beyond bounds, spread rapidly, and threatened the destruction to part of our train. At the critical moment, two strange Indians rushed upon the scene and rendered good service. After the fire was extinguished, the Indians were rewarded and were also given a generous meal at the tent of Mr. Graves. Later, they settled themselves in friendly fashion beside his fire and were soon fast asleep. Next morning, the Indians were gone, and had taken with them a new shirt and a yoke of good oxen belonging to their host. Within the week, Indians again sneaked up to camp and stole one of Mr. Graves' saddle horses. These were trials which made men swear vengeance, yet no one felt it would be safe to follow the marauders. Who could know that the train was not being stealthily followed by cunning plunderers who would await their chance to get away with the wagons if left weakly guarded? Conditions were now such that it seemed best to divide the train into sections and put each section under a sub-leader. Our men were well equipped with sidearms, rifles, and ammunition. Nevertheless, anxious moments were common as the wagons moved slowly and singly through the dense thickets, narrow defiles, and rugged mountain gorges, one section often being out of sight of the others, and each man realizing that there could be no concerted action in the event of a general attack, that each must stay by his own wagon and defend as best he could the lives committed to his care. No one rode horseback now except the leaders, and those in charge of the loose cattle. When darkness obscured the way, and after feeding time, each section formed its wagons into a circle to serve as cattle corral, and night watches were keenly alert to give a still alarm if anything unusual came within sight or sound. Day after day, from dawn to twilight, we moved onward, never stopping except to give the oxen the necessary nooning, or to give them drink when water was available. Gradually, the distance between sections lengthened, and so it happened that the wagons of my father and my uncle were 2 days in advance of the others, on the 8th of October, when Mr. Reed, on horseback, overtook us. He was haggard and in great tribulation. His lips quivered as he gave substantially the following account of circumstances which had made him the slayer of his friend and a lone wanderer in the wilderness. On the morning of October 5, when Mr. Reed's section broke camp, he and Mr. Eddy ventured off to hunt antelope, and were shot at a number of times by Indians with bows and arrows. Empty-handed and disappointed, the two followed and overtook their companions about noon at the foot of a steep hill near Gravelly Ford, where the teams had to be doubled for the ascent. All the wagons, except Pike's and Reed's, and one of the Graveses in charge of John Snyder, had already been taken to the top. Snyder was in the act of starting his team when Milton Elliott, driving Reed's oxen with Eddy's in the lead, also started. Suddenly, the Reed and Eddy cattle became unmanageable, and in some way got mixed up with Snyder's team. This provoked both drivers, and fierce words passed between them. Snyder declared that the Reed team ought to be made to drag its wagon up without help. Then he began to beat his own cattle about the head to get them out of the way. Mr. Reed attempted to remonstrate with him for his cruelty, at which Snyder became more enraged, and threatened to strike both Reed and Elliott with his whip for interfering. Mr. Reed replied sharply that they would settle the matter later. This Snyder took as a threat, and retorted, "No, we'll settle it right here," and struck Reed over the head with the butt end of his whip, cutting an ugly scalp wound. Mrs. Reed, who rushed between the two men for the purpose of separating them, caught the force of the second blow from Snyder's whip on her shoulder. While dodging the third blow, Reed drew his hunting knife and stabbed Snyder in the left breast. 15 minutes later, John Snyder, with his head resting on the arm of William Graves, died, and Mr. Reed stood beside the corpse, dazed and sorrowful. Nearby sections were immediately called into camp, and gloom, consternation, and anger pervaded it. Mr. Reed and family were taken to their tent some distance from the others and guarded by their friends. Later, an assembly was convened to decide what should be done. The majority declared the deed murder, and demanded retribution. Mr. Eddy and others pleaded extenuating circumstances, and proposed that the accused should leave the camp. After heated discussion, this compromise was adopted, the assembly voting that Mr. Reed should be banished from the company. Mr. Reed maintained that the deed was not prompted by malice, that he had acted in self-defense and in defense of his wife, and that he would not be driven from his helpless, dependent family. The assembly promised that the company would care for his family, and limited his stay in camp. His wife, fearing the consequence of non-compliance with the sentence, begged him to abide by it, and to push on to the settlement, procure food and assistance, and return for her and their children. The following morning, after participating in the funeral rites over the lamented dead, Mr. Reed took leave of his friends and sorrowing family, and left the camp. The group around my father's wagon were deeply touched by Mr. Reed's narrative. Its members were friends of the slain and of the slayer. Their sympathies clustered around the memory of the dead and clung to the living. They deplored the death of a fellow traveler who had manly faced many hardships and was young, genial, and full of promise. They regretted the act which took from the company a member who had been prominent in its organization, had helped to formulate its rules, and had, up to that unfortunate hour, been a co-worker with the other leading spirits for its best interests. It was plain that the hardships and misfortunes of the journey had sharpened the tempers of both men, and the vexations of the morning had been too much for the overstrained nerves. Mr. Reed breakfasted at our tent, but did not continue his journey alone. Walter Heron, one of my father's helpers, decided to accompany him, and after hurried preparations, they went away together, bearing an urgent appeal from my father to Captain Sutter for necessary teams and provisions to carry the company through to California, also his personal pledge in writing that he would be responsible for the payment of the debt as soon as he should reach the settlement. My father believed the two men would reach their destination long before the slowly moving train. Immediately after the departure of Messrs. Reed and Heron, our wagons moved onward. Night overtook us at a gruesome place where wood and feed were scarce, and every drop of water was browned by alkali. There hungry wolves howled, and there we found and buried the bleaching bones of Mr. Salley, a member of the Hastings train, who had been shot by Indians. After his companions had left his grave, the savages had returned, dug up the body, robbed it of its clothing, and left it to the wolves. At 4 o'clock the following morning, October 10, the rest of the company, having traveled all night, drove into camp. Many were in a state of great excitement, and some almost frenzied by the physical and mental suffering they had endured. Accounts of the Reed-Snyder tragedy differed somewhat from that we had already heard. The majority held that the assembly had been lenient with Mr. Reed and considerate for his family, that the action taken had been largely influenced by rules which Messrs. Reed, Donner, Thornton, and others had suggested for the government of Colonel